I want to start off by congratulating you because we've made it to the end of the first half of 2020. What a year it's been, right? It's far from over. There's still so much ahead of us that's unknown, but it's so easy to look at this first half and and I don't know about you, but it's felt long, right? It's felt like wow, there's so much that's been going on in our world, and there have many times I've been thinking, why can't we just start all over again? Can't we just press another button, just erase all of this, look at the light click, and let's start all over again, right? I mean, what a crazy time it's been. In fact, there's a song from the 90s that kind of kept ringing in my head right through these different weeks and these different moments. It's a bit of a neo-hippie anthem of the 90s, and a group called the Four Non-Blondes. They wrote a song, and it's it kind of goes like this. So I wake in the morning and I step outside and I take a deep breath and I get real high and I scream at the top of my voice, "What's going on?" And that phrase, kind of "what's going on," has been a bit of my anthem right through these couple of weeks and months. So often I find myself, Lord, what's happening? What's going on with the world right now? And I don't know where you are right now and what's happening with you, but it's very possible that you too have experienced, maybe through this season, but maybe through even other seasons as well, the sense of being overwhelmed. This is just too much. What's happening? Hard to figure out what's going on, hard to even understand what's happening. And the truth is, we're not quite out of it yet, right? We're going to continue, right? Right now, just as you and I were feeling, okay, we kind of know how to work from home. We're just getting used to this. Now everything's opening up. Everything's starting to change again. Kids have got new routines. Work has got new requirements and new demands, and things changing all the time. And it's very possible to feel like, what do I do? What's going on? This is just too much. This is overwhelming, and I need to figure out. How do I manage this? How do I continue to have hope and faith? How do I continue to have strength for each day and for each new season that seems to come at me? If you've ever found yourself there, if you're feeling like that right now, you know what? I think God has got something to say to us through the prophet Haggai. And so we've been looking at this Old Testament text, an ancient document, a prophetic text. And what that means is that Haggai was a prophet, and he heard the voice of God, and he would speak to the people on behalf of God. And if you've been tracking with us, Haggai had 4 messages, and each week we've been looking at one of those messages. And he was speaking particularly to the people who had come back from exile, and after they had returned, what God had asked them to do was to rebuild the temple, or to rebuild the temple. And they so easily got distracted. And this is a message you and I need to keep reminding ourselves, because in a world that's continually being disrupted, it's so easy for us to lose focus, to forget our priority. So let's keep prioritizing the things that please God, and keep the main thing in the midst of everything that's disrupting our world. And so that was the message that God gave his people in that time. And so they began rebuilding the temple. But 1 month into that, they started to feel discouraged. They started to compare. They started to look and think, hey, what are we doing? It doesn't seem very meaningful. It doesn't seem to be very significant compared to the previous temple that was built by Solomon. But God came and said, no, don't do this comparison. Don't belittle what's in your hands. That even what you're doing is, do not consider it as nothing, because God is in the midst, and God is doing his new great work in the midst of what seems to even be something small. And as they continued, they thought things should change, right? Because they said, okay, we're doing God's work. They're doing the things that God has called us to do. Surely now our economic situation should change. Our lives should get better, but it doesn't. And God speaks to them and says this, really, you can't do sacred work if your hearts are soiled. And so the word there was that, we can't be a people who are defiled with the things that we're called to do. And so it's a challenge for us to recognize that it's not just what we do externally, but it's who we are internally that needs to change. And that's the wonderful gift that Jesus gives each one of us. And so each week we've been looking at a thought or an idea that comes out of Haggai's prophecies. And as you've noticed, they've all begun with the letter D. And so this week, as we close and wrap up the series, we've got also one more word that we're going to use to describe the promise of what Haggai is saying to God's people. And maybe just for fun, some of you would like to guess, what do you think that word is? I'll give you a hint. It begins with the letter D. And if that's you, why don't you try and put some guesses in the chat box? What do you think is the one word that is going to describe today's message? But as we look at this last message, the timing of it is actually the same day that God gave Haggai the third message. So the 18th of December, 520 BC, God gave Haggai two messages. One that had to do with the idea of not living as defiled people, and the other is the one that we're looking at today. And in order for us to understand this, we're going to look at one person. This person, whose name we have come across through the book of Haggai. But we're going to take a deep dive and try and understand a bit more about who this person is. Because I think so often we can be like Zerubbabel in the experiences that we have to face in our world today. Zerubbabel was the governor of the people who had returned from exile and they were in Judah. Now, Zerubbabel, the word, his name means son of Babel, which means he was probably someone who was born in Babylon. Now think about that. Zerubbabel had no experience of Judah, had no experience of Jerusalem. His life, he grew up in Babylon. That was his life. That was his community. He probably got into the civil service as he grew up a little bit. And then he was appointed as the governor by a Persian king and by a Persian ruler. The reason is because the Persian rulers still wanted to own and see kind of what was happening with the Jewish people, even though they allowed them to return. So Zerubbabel had this task of bringing these 50,000 Jews back. He had to organize them, figure out who wanted to come back, and lead them back from exile, from Babylon, back to Judah. Now, if you ever remember those times when we used to finish church services and we had to figure out what to do for lunch, I remember those moments. 6 or 7 people, right? We had to figure out, where do we go for lunch? Where do we go for dinner? And just organizing 6 or 7 people was a work and a half. What do you want? What do you want? Do you have any ideas? Where do you want to go? Okay, let's all agree. Let's agree we want to go here. Then how are we going to go? You go in this car, you go in this, you take this MRT. And just organizing a few people was so difficult. Poor Zerubbabel had to organize 50,000 people. And this was not a short journey. This was a journey, and some people would say even up to 1,000 kilometers. So this would have taken months for them to come back to Judah. A difficult, treacherous journey. And you can imagine the challenges that Zerubbabel must have faced. People grumbling, people complaining, hey, what about me? You're going too fast, you're going too slow, what about the weather? Do I have any, extra this? Do you have any extra that? And Zerubbabel had to deal with all of that. And he was just the governor. He was not even very high in the totem pole. He was kind of like middle management, having to figure out all these things. He comes back and he brings the people back, and they have the task of rebuilding the temple. And so he gets them resources and he tells them what to do, and they start to rebuild the temple. And the people are enthusiastic, but soon they lose priority, they lose steam, and they give up. And Zerubbabel also is caught, as it were, not really sure what to do and what needs to happen. 20 years pass, and Haggai comes. And then Zerubbabel stood up again, and he tries and organizes them to rebuild that temple. And now it's difficult because there's economic hardship. There's a drought. They're faced with financial difficulties. They don't have the resource that they need to do. And Zerubbabel's in charge. He needs to figure out, now, what do I do? Where do I get these resources? How do I help these people see the vision of what they need to do and help them finish the rebuilding of the temple? And as they were rebuilding, we've just heard it, right? They got discouraged. And you know what? As a leader, like to have to motivate people who are discouraged when you yourself are wondering, how do you do all of this? Where does the resource come? What's going to happen? And maybe some of you right now, that's how you're feeling. You think of your family, and as the leader of your family, as the parents of your kids, you're trying to figure out, now, where are we going to get the resource? How are we going to make sure that there's enough for what needs to happen in the next couple of months? Maybe you think of your family, and where's the food going to come, or where's the money going to come in the next season? Maybe you're a business owner, and your boss or your department head, and you're trying to figure out, how do I reorganize what's going to happen with my company and what's going to happen with my team? That's all the things that Zerubbabel was facing. It was hard. It was difficult. People were complaining. People were discouraged. And he had to figure out what to do, how to figure out what was happening here. And I'm sure if Zerubbabel had heard the Four Non-Blondes, he would have sung, "What's Going On?" It's a very human feeling to throw your hands up and say, "Lord, what's happening? How do I even understand what's going on all around me?" And that's why we want to look at Zerubbabel, because it's so important for us to see, what does God do with this one person, Zerubbabel? Because maybe we can learn And we can have the confidence that if God was to treat this one person, Zerubbabel, in a certain way, maybe God is also saying the same things to us today as well. And so we're going to pick up the prophecy and the text from Haggai chapter 2, verses 20 to 23. Just 3 verses. And this is the end of the book of Haggai. The word of the Lord came a second time to Haggai on the 24th day of the month. So same day as the third message. And then God says to Haggai, speak to Zerubbabel. We're going to pause here for a while. And I want you to understand the power or the significance of this moment. Because up to this point, whenever you saw the name Zerubbabel in Haggai, you noticed that Zerubbabel was always mentioned with Joshua the priest and with the people. And so it was Joshua and Zerubbabel. And now at the end of this, God says, speak to Zerubbabel. And here's what I want you to know. That it's so easy for us in the midst of feeling overwhelmed and feeling, there's so many things we need to figure out and there's so much we need to understand and that we don't know about our future. It's so easy in these seasons to think that maybe God is only concerned about the big. There are nations right now that God has to intervene in. There's global issues that God has to do stuff in. And sometimes we can think God is really just only concerned about those big things. But you know what this tells me? It tells me that in the midst of all the national issues, in the midst of cosmic, global issues, God still sees the one. And somebody this morning needs to be reminded of this powerful truth. That God, yes, He's the God of the nations, and He's the God of the universe, but He's also the God who sees you exactly where you're at. He knows you intimately, and He knows what's going on in your world. In the New Testament, Jesus tells a story and He says, that God is the God who would leave the 99 to go after the one. And sometimes you and I can feel like we're just the one. And there's so many more important things that God should be dealing. There's so many more significant things that God, and bigger problems that God needs to sort out. Does God really hear me? Does God really care about me? I came to categorically say yes. The Bible is replete with stories of God who went after the one. And right now, as you think about whatever you're facing, whatever you're going through, you know what? I just want to start by reminding us that we may be disrupted, but we're not deserted. That's the word for today. That we're not deserted. That God is with us. And God sees you. There is a personal word that God wants to give and reveal to you in the midst of all that's going on. I wonder whether you're like me and you realize that even though it seems that there's this global thing going on, that somehow it seems like God has orchestrated this or allowed this even to happen so that I personally would hear His voice in very unique and personal ways. That's a God who can, on 2 levels, on multiple levels, be able to, look at what's happening in a cosmic, on a corporate level, but at the same time, understand what's going on the personal level. So yes, we're disrupted, but we're not deserted. And that must give us hope and courage. Because Zerubbabel needed this word. The work still needed to be done. The temple was still in ruins. There was mountains of rubble all around. And he had to organize what needed to happen. And they had to continue the work of rebuilding. And so God speaks to this one person. And he's described as the governor of Judah. Interestingly enough, you notice that something is missing here as well. Because up to this point, whenever we have the name Zerubbabel, we're given his place in his family. And so we're given his family tree. And so we're told Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel. But right now, that phrase, son of Shealtiel, is missing here. It's going to come out shortly, but it's missing here. And what's focused on when God speaks to Zerubbabel is that he's the governor of Judah. Now, this is not a priestly role. This is a civil role that he played. He was in charge and he was like a civil servant and he was in charge as a governor. Middle management. And if you've ever been there or you know people in middle management, you know the challenge of middle management. Because you've got bosses that you need to please, and then you've got a team that you need to lead, and you've got people who've got various ideas and different emotions, and you've got to manage all of that. And it's so often very easy to feel lost in the midst, like this, this middle of a sandwich, lost between these two things. And figuring out what your bosses need and figuring out what the people need, and sometimes they don't match. That's exactly where Zerubbabel is, a difficult situation. And when we find ourselves in these overwhelming what's going on situation, let's be reminded that God has not deserted us, but God sees and knows us exactly where we're at. And then now comes this incredible prophetic image. And there's a lot we could say with this, but we don't have the time to do this. But I do want to make a point with this particular passage. And from verse 21, here's what Haggai says of the Lord, and the Lord is speaking. I am about to shake the heavens and the earth. And let's pause there. God says to Zerubbabel, one person, I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth. Now, it's interesting to try and figure out what's the prophetic fulfillment of this. You know, one of the wonderful things about Bible prophecy is that there is a nearness to the prophecies as well as a distance. You know, and so trying to understand how these prophecies fulfill themselves. And many commentators and scholars tell us that there's this messianic voice to this. So some of these prophecies are even things that we are experiencing today as we await for Christ's second coming. But I want to focus us on something else, and it's in the text. But when you look at this sentence, you have to ask yourself, what's the subject of this particular phrase, right? What's the subject? We can get excited about the shaking, right? Because, you know, when God shakes the heavens and the earth, it can be very dramatic. But I think the focus here is not so much on what the shaking is like, but on who is doing the shaking. And the text tells us over and over again, God says, I am about to shake the heavens and the earth. And I was thinking about this, and I'm thinking, why does God say to Zerubbabel, I am about to shake the heavens and the earth? Because I think there's something that God wants Zerubbabel to get in the midst of his chaos, in the midst of his disruption. And what he needs to get is not that there is going to come a shaking, but that who is behind the shaking. You see, if you think about this idea, you only really can shake something that's less powerful than you are, right? I could shake this camera because I'm bigger and stronger than this camera. But I can't shake this building because I'm not bigger or stronger than this building, right? A kid can shake a toy, but a kid cannot shake a house, right? Because the kid doesn't have the power or the strength to shake something that's bigger and stronger than the kid is. And maybe what God was trying to remind Zerubbabel is this, that the heavens and the earth can be shaken because God is bigger and more powerful than the heavens and the earth. And that phrase, heavens and the earth, is a merism in language, right? And so it's a linguistic form which just basically means everything. That God is bigger and he can shake heavens, he can shake everything. He's bigger and more powerful. Why? Because Zerubbabel needed to be reminded in the midst of his chaos, in the midst of all the things that he needed to sort out, in the what's going on, God is still God. And then God tells him this. He says that this God, I'm about to shake the heavens and the earth, and I'm about to overthrow the thrones of the kingdom. The Hebrew word that is used here is a word that was used to describe Sodom and Gomorrah. And so what God is doing is that he's giving Zerubbabel echoes and hints of things that he already did. And God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah in a dramatic form. God says this, I am about to destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations. And Zerubbabel was right in the midst of experiencing that because he knew of Assyria that was overtaken by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians then were overtaken by the Persians, and God changed the heart of the Persian king to allow them now to come back. And so Zerubbabel saw firsthand God destroying the strength of the kingdoms right around him. And then God says this, and he will overthrow the chariots and their riders. And this echoed of God's power to overcome the pharaohs and the power of Egypt over the slaves and the Hebrew slaves in the Exodus. And the horses and their riders shall go down. And that story is right there in Exodus. Everyone by the sword of his brother, echoing Gideon as he led the people to fight the Midianites. And that Midian army ended up being confused and they started killing each other. Point being, God was saying, if I have done it before, I can do it again. What he has done in the past, he's capable of doing again. Now, maybe he's going to do it differently, but the point is not how he's going to do it. The point is that this God has, and therefore this God can. You know what? Whenever you find yourself confused and you throw your hands up and say, what's going on? Remind yourself, has God come through for you in the past? And I know the answer is yes. Has God been faithful to you in the past? And I know the answer is yes. Then if it's true in the past, then you know what? Whatever's going on right now, He is faithful today. And He will continue to be strong and mighty on your behalf in the today as we step into the tomorrow. You see, what God needed Zerubbabel to hear in the midst of his chaos, in the midst of his disruption, is that God is still sovereign. And then there's the second part of this prophecy. And God goes on to say through Haggai, on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, and here's the phrase, the son of Shealtiel. Now this phrase is echoed right through the book of Haggai. The son of Shealtiel, the son of Shealtiel. And some of you may be thinking, okay, so he had a father, his father's name was Shealtiel. But actually Shealtiel was not his father. Dang, dang, dang. If you go to 1 Chronicles chapter 3, you will see actually the genealogy, the family tree of Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel's right here at the end, and so Zerubbabel and Shimei, and I assume they're brothers, had a father. And his father was these two, and the sons of Pedaiah. We haven't heard this word before. But what the Bible tells us is that actually Zerubbabel's father was not Shealtiel. Zerubbabel's father was Pedaiah. Now some are thinking, how come, what's happening? Then you've already seen it, right? Because Shealtiel is there. So Shealtiel and Pedaiah were brothers. If you understand some of the culture of the Hebrew people, here's probably what took place. Pedaiah was Zerubbabel's father, but Pedaiah probably died. After, we don't know why, but there's every likelihood that he probably died. Now the custom or the rule at that time was that one of the brothers would then take over the role. So here's what I want you to see. That Zerubbabel, born in Babylon, was actually adopted. He didn't even have his own family there. That was his family situation. So this poor guy Zerubbabel already had to lead in such challenging situations, but personally, he had personal challenges in his own life. That's not all. Because Zerubbabel's grandfather is a guy by the name of Jeconiah. Now, if you know some of your Bible history, Jeconiah is the last king before the Babylonian captivity, before the Babylonian conquest happens. And Jeconiah was a terrible, evil king. So much so that God looked at that King Jeconiah and basically says, I've had it with you. I take the signet ring and I throw it away. You are done. It was like the proverbial straw on the camel's back. And straight after that, then the judgment happened with the conquest of Babylon into Jerusalem. So here's it. Zerubbabel, adopted, his own family is gone, and his grandfather was perhaps one of the worst kings in the land, and God had rejected that particular king. This poor guy, Zerubbabel, had a tough role to play and had a tough personal story. But what I want you to see is this. No matter what your story is, no matter what your past is, no matter how difficult your situation is right now, God has not deserted you. God can use somebody like Zerubbabel in the midst of all that crazy, in the midst of all that chaos. Surely God can use someone like you as well. No matter what your history is like, no matter what your story is like, God has a purpose for your life. God has a plan for your life. And so we come back then to this passage. And so Haggai says, on that day, I think what God was reminding Zerubbabel was, you know what? It may seem that your background, your family situation was difficult, but God has appointed times for you. That's important, because sometimes we can ask ourselves, am I really meant to do what I'm supposed to do? Have I missed it? And the answer is no. If you're in Christ, you've been following God and been walking with God, you cannot miss it. Because as long as you say, God, I want to remain faithful to you, then whatever it is, it may seem lost right now, but God can redeem it, because God is the God of the kairos. as much as he's the God of the chronos. He knows what's going on, and he has an appointed day, an appointed time for you and I. And that time is right now with whatever's going on in your world. What does God say to Zerubbabel? Such powerful words. God says, I have chosen you. I don't know if those words do anything to you, but they're powerful. You know, this idea of being chosen. I think there's something in all of us that long to be chosen. You know, whether it's to be chosen to represent your school in a sports team, whether it's to be chosen to sing the solo, whether it's to be chosen to be in a relationship, whether it's chosen by somebody to say, will you marry me? Whether it's chosen for that promotion. There's something in all of us that longs for the sense of being chosen. And you know, isn't that powerful that God would look at this one man who, where it seemed everything was difficult, everything was hard, and God says, I have chosen you. You know, I'm a bit of a sucker for these song competitions, you know, on YouTube and on TV. You know, somebody comes up and they sing this song, and they sing amazing in front of 3 or 4 judges, and you know, then after they finish, the audience, you know, rapturous sort of applause. Everybody's, you know, standing on their feet, and this person's like overwhelmed at how people think that you know, this person has a gift and this person can sing. You know what I'm talking about, right? And then the judges, they, you know, give their comments, and they, you know, say things about the person's performance. But no matter what the comments are, then they come to that one point, right, where they have to vote. And so one of the judges will say, okay, you know what? Yep, we have to vote. And then one judge will look at the person and say, you know, it's a yes for me. And the next judge goes, it's a yes for me. The third judge goes, you have 3 yeses. And the fourth judge goes, it's a yes from me. And you know, the music swells, and this person's in tears, you know, and everybody's, you know, excited, and everybody's standing and cheering. But why are those moments so powerful on TV? Because I think there's something in all of us that wants to hear somebody say, I have chosen you. You have my yes. And today, someone listening to this message, you need to hear this, that I don't know what's going on in your world. I don't know the challenges you're experiencing right now, but I do know this. God would say to you, I have chosen you. And I know maybe you're thinking, God, why would you choose me? You know, I feel this a lot, like, God, what, you know, I can't do a whole lot. I'm not all that great. Why would you pick me? And God doesn't pick us because of the great that we have or the great that we can do. There's nothing we can bring to the table, but that's how much he loves us. That he will say, you have my yes. It is yes for me. And so God chooses Zerubbabel. And we need to remind ourselves that even though you may feel you don't know what you're doing, God would say to you, I've chosen you to be the right mom for those kids. I've chosen you to be the right life group leader for that community. I've chosen you to be the right manager for your team. I've chosen you to be the right citizen for this nation in this time as well. God has chosen us. But why are we chosen? Not just so that we would enjoy the blessing that comes from being chosen. God says to Haggai, on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you and make you. And this is a bit that's a little hard sometimes, but if we hear it and we receive it, then we know, why is it God picks us? Why is it God chooses us? So that he can take us to transform us, to make us. I don't know what it is, but I do know this. The message and the mess of all that we're experiencing in this world is that God wants to do something in your life. He wants to change you. And I know you're thinking, you know, it's my spouse that needs to change, or my kids that need to change. You know, but I think you need to hear this. God would say to you that he wants you to, he's come to take you to make you, if you will let him. And if we invite God's transformative work, then he works us, it changes us from the inside out. He gives us his spirit, and he starts to transform the way we think. He starts to give us perspectives that come from heaven. He gives us the mind of Christ as New Testament believers. And so Zerubbabel needed this promise. that God had not deserted him, but God had watched him, God had chosen him, and God was going to change him and help him become the leader that he needed to be for the people. And then God says this to Zerubbabel, and I will make you like a signet ring. Remember his grandfather? Yeah, God's told the grandfather, I have taken the signet ring and I've thrown it away. And now God says to Zerubbabel, you will be my signet ring. Now what's the signet ring? The signet ring was kind of like a guarantee. It's a bit like a signature that we would use today. And so it was either on the hand of the king or it was hung around the king's neck, like a necklace, because it would be close to his heart. And what would be on that signet would be the sign or the seal of the king. And when the king would make a decree, they would write the decree down and they would put it on a scroll, and then they would put wax, and then they would seal it with the seal and the emblem from that signet ring. Now, as long as that was there, then people who got the scroll had guarantee that this was from the king. This was the rule of the king. And here's what God was saying to Zerubbabel. This guy who was adopted, who came from a challenging family environment, who was already leading in a difficult situation, God said to him, you have my authority. Do you know, Christian, if you're listening to this, that God has given you authority? That you can proclaim his truth into your family, into your world? That you have authority over the enemy and you can bind and loose according to the truth of what God has revealed? That you and I have been given authority to go and make disciples? That we may not be all that powerful, but God has said that he gives us his authority. We are his signet ring today. And so God chooses us to change us, but to call us to be his ambassadors. Why? Because there's a new phrase that God introduces to Zerubbabel's life. We know him as the governor. We know him as the son of Shealtiel. But now God says to Zerubbabel, you are my servant. And I think this is the clincher. Because God was reminding Zerubbabel, I know it seems messy and I know it seems confusing, but if you will remember and if you will allow me, you let me be your God. And if you will be my servant, you will do my purposes, then the outcome that happens is not for you to decide. I will decide. It is God's plan. It is God's timing. It is his will. And that sometimes is something hard for us, because we want God to do our bidding and we want God to fulfill our will. But today, maybe some of us, in the midst of the chaos, the reason we feel it is because we're still trying to control everything around us. And maybe we need to say, you know what? My name is Rhordan, but this is my role. I am God's servant. And so he determines the outcome. He determines what's required of me. And if he calls me to rebuild a little bit of this temple with rubble, then I'm just going to be faithful to keep doing that, in spite of the crazy that's going on around me. You see, God came to Zerubbabel with the task that he needed to do. And God was coming to encourage him, to say and remind him that God is sovereign, yes, but he was also selected. And you need to know this. God is sovereign. He's still sovereign. He's sovereign over your family, sovereign over your life, sovereign over this nation. But he has selected you. He has chosen you for a work right now in the midst of this crazy. So here's what I'm asking you to do. It's actually really simple. It's from the modern prophet Nike. Just do it. Whatever is ahead of you, just do it. Does it feel like it's impossible? Just take the next step and just do it. Do you have, like 18 chapters to study for an exam? Start with chapter 1 and just do it. Have you got to lead this team through all this change and all this chaos and it's frustrating and you don't know what you have to do? Just take the next step and just do it. You have been chosen for this time. God's going to change you and he's given you the authority to take the next step. Are you trying to figure out what to do with your family? Just do it. Do whatever's in your hand. Don't compare. Don't kind of mope about, it's rubble and it doesn't seem to be all that glorious. Just do whatever's in your hands right now. You know what we know about Zerubbabel is this, is that he was faithful, because Zechariah the prophet who was speaking into the same time says that Zerubbabel completed his task. And so whatever it is that we have to do, just keep doing it. And it's not going to make it easier. It's not going to make it simpler. It might get more complex. It might feel frustrating, but just know that He is sovereign and He has chosen you. He is sovereign and you are selected. Because there's a really interesting thing that happens hundreds of years after this. And we find this now in the Gospel of Matthew. And you'd also find it in the Gospel of Luke. And Matthew is telling us the story of Jesus' birth. And in this list of names, in this family tree, in this genealogy, in Matthew chapter 1, here's what that genealogy says. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah, remember, grandfather, bad king, was the father of Shealtiel. We know him now. Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. So we have Jeconiah, and we have Zerubbabel. And then the genealogy carries on. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. There was no way that Zerubbabel understood what God was doing. He had all this chaos and all this difficulty, and his family, personal life was also challenging. But he just did what was in his hands, and he trusted God, who was sovereign, who was working things out. And there was no way for him to know this, but he was going to end up causing the Davidic promise to happen, because he was going to be the one in line who would see the Messiah come into this world. Here's what you need to understand. We cannot fully understand what's happening here, like Zerubbabel perhaps, but God is always painting on a canvas bigger than we can see or understand. And if you look at the scriptures and you know this, then you and I need to have this worldview, this thing set in our hearts that, in the midst of this, we trust that God is painting on a canvas bigger than we can see or understand. And so whatever the future holds, whatever's going to happen, it is going to be okay because He's still sovereign. So do whatever's in your hands. We are disrupted, but we're not deserted. Would you let that word, those words bring strength to you, bring hope to you? Yeah, everything seems to be interrupting our lives again, but we're not deserted. He is still sovereign, and you are selected for this moment. You have what it takes. He will transform you, and He's given you His authority. Just choose to let Him be God.